welcome back. So, let us move on to conceptual dependency theory, which as I said earlier was developed by Roger Schank and his group as a representation scheme to represent everyday actions in with a small set of predicates. So, the CD theory defines a semantic base for natural language. As I said, their goal was to understand natural language stories. The CD theory is designed for everyday actions. What I would say is that we should study the way this works, and if you want to design a language something like CD theory for a special domain, we can do that, and then we can map the translations from English which is talking about those concepts into this thing. So, this should basically illustrate the idea. It does not mean that we should use the same predicates, because they are actually in some sense very fine grained, as we will see. So, that is what I have said here, that more specific domains would require specific sets of primitives. So, if you want to do knowledge representation in a particular domain, you can choose your own set of primitives. The basic unit in CD theory is something called a conceptualization, which is a little bit like a well formed formula in logic. The main concept, one of the main components of a conceptualization is an event, which is defined by an actor, an agent, an object and a sense of direction. We will look at these. So, a conceptualization is made up of two things: concepts and relations between concepts. We have already explored this idea when we looked at semantic net and so on, except that the semantic net explored the idea, or the knowledge graph that we studied explored the idea without trying to define a set of concepts, whereas what Schank and his group have done is they have to try to define a small set of concepts and express everything else in terms of that. So, concepts are made up of something called nominals or noun phrases, which they called as picture producers, and actions, which they call as act. Now, these are inherently governing categories of language in the sense that they can stand by themselves. If I talk about an individual Peter, then I can understand the concept that I am talking about a person. If I talk about an action called rowing, for example, then I know that I am talking about somebody rowing a boat and stuff like that. So, they can stand by themselves. There are also modifiers which modify the concepts. So, they call them picture aiders and action aiders. So, aiders are like adjectives and action aiders are like adverbs. So, instead of saying that he rowed a boat, you can say he rowed the boat fast or something like that, or he ran quickly and things like that. Nominals and actions can exist as independent notions. Nominals stand for objects and people, actions are acts of nominal. Modifiers give additional information on the nominals or actions. A dependent concept predicts the existence of a governor. So, adjectives can't stand by themselves, adjectives have to apply to something, adverbs have to apply to something. A conceptualization, as defined by Roger Schank, is a collection of concepts and relations in which there is at least a two-way dependency, and we will see what they mean by this dependency. It tells you something about the world. Conceptual dependency theory defines a small set of actions. So, there were 2 or 3 versions. In one set there were 11 actions, in another set there were 14 actions, but as you can see they are a small set. It can be described in a logic like syntax. In fact, Charniak and McDermott in their book on AI, they did describe it using logical syntax. But they can also be depicted graphically by what they call as C diagrams or concept diagrams, which, as you will see, they are a little bit close to how we could depict knowledge graphs essentially. There is no essential difference between the two in any case. As I said, what distinguishes conceptual dependency theory is the choice of predicates. So, a small set of conceptual primitives. Conceptual dependency theory is a representation scheme in which a small set of state predicates and a small set of conceptual actions are used as primitives, and everything else is described in terms of these. The aim of the research was understanding natural language stories. We have said that by understanding, we mean expressing them in terms of CD actions and states essentially. So, it is like translating into this language or mapping into this language. The understanding was demonstrated by programs answering questions on stories essentially. So, if they could answer questions, then one presumes that they have created an understanding of the story essentially. So, you can, if you subscribe to this viewpoint that there is a conceptual base which serves as the meaning of natural language sentences, then you can see that there is something which you can call as semantic parsing, which means, which is of course different from syntactic parsing. In syntactic parsing of a English sentence, you will break it down into noun phrase, verb phrase and that kind of stuff. In semantic parsing, you will try to identify what are the conceptual primitives that sentence is talking about. In any case, it will translate into conceptual dependency formulas, which are basically in first order logic. We have already seen that the meaning of first order logic can be given in terms of interpretation, that is, you choose a domain and you choose a mapping, which is in some sense the model of the world that what you are talking about. So, in that way, natural language can be related to the world that you are talking about via this conceptual dependency theory. Now, this group was very active in the mid 70s and early 80s or up to mid 80s one might say, and some of the programs that this group wrote were as follows. There was a program called LE, English Language Interpreter, by Riesbeck, was a semantic parser used to convert English into CD theory. One of the earliest programs they wrote was called Margie, written by the group working with Chang, would make inferences based on the meaning of input sentences using Chuck Rieger's inferencing program. Now, I should emphasize here that they are making inferences, they are not necessarily doing deductions. So, it is not as if they are doing logical reasoning, but they are making inferences, that they see something and they infer something from that essentially. And we will see examples. So, you will realize that we are not talking about deduction here. Babel was a program written by Goldman, which converted the output into English. SAM, a script applier mechanism, we shall have a little bit of a look at that after we are done with CD theory, by Cullingford, was a program to use scripts. So, there was this structure called scripts, which we will see, to understand stories based on stereotypical situations. Frumpf was another program they wrote for story understanding by De Jong. All these were PhD students, they were working with Roger Schank. This Frumpf was directly linked to the Newswire and it generates summaries of stories that it was reading. PAM was plan applier mechanism, was a program that could reason about goals and plans and actions. How actions are tied to how actions are parts of plans and how plans are made for goals and so on essentially. So, this is in terms of knowledge, this is not in terms of automated planning, that domain independent planning community studies, where you try to figure out how to generate a plan. This is saying that you know already that if you have this goal, then you have these possible plans and these plans will have these possible constituents. If we get time, we might peep into that a little bit. Politics was a program by Carbonell, which could reason about subjective goals from the liberal and the conservative viewpoint. So, it could reason about stories which were geopolitical in nature. Wendy Lenhart wrote a program which focused on how to answer questions essentially, how to understand what is the intent behind the question and then give an appropriate answer. Tailspin was a program by James Meehan, was a program to generate stories in English. So, if you have all this knowledge about what is happening in the world, expressed in some conceptual base, then you can give some goals to some fictional characters and choose a path that they might possibly follow, and his stories were like that. Boris by Dyer put together many of these ideas from the Yale group together into one mammoth program, which could really understand fairly complex stories. So, you should look up Boris and Dyer, and you might get some stories that the program could answer questions about. So, as I said, the way to accept that they are understanding the thing is if they could answer questions. And Cyrus was a program by Janet Kolodner, which modeled episodic memories. So, by then the group had started, Roger Schank in particular had started talking about something called dynamic memory, and it said that basically our memory gets enriched with experiences and it grows and grows, and it kind of the term that he used was ossifies, that how many experiences ossify into a script, which is like a high level representation of those typical solutions. And this Kolodner's work led to the rise of a field called case based reasoning, which curiously was partly responsible for loss of interest in knowledge representation as proposed in CD theory. So, the conceptual dependency theory, representation of meaning of sentences. The basic idea that they wanted to pursue was that for two sentences with identical meaning regardless of language. Now, language, as we have been observing, is rich and diversified, and it can also be ambiguous. What the goal of this canonical representation is that if different English language sentences or Hindi language sentences or Tamil language sentences are talking about the same thing, then the representation of meaning should be identical. There should be only one representation. Any information that is implicit in the sentence must be made explicit in the representation via inferences. So, we will see as we go along what kind of information we are talking about. But one thing that we have kind of mentioned in the passing is terms like yesterday. Yesterday does not make sense in representation, you have to put in a date. But also, as you will see when you look at scripts later, we will see that if you are talking about somebody going into a restaurant, then you already know many things about what would happen and so on essentially. So, some of that information would be made explicit essentially. The meaning propositions underlying language are called conceptualizations. We have mentioned that, and there are two kinds of conceptualizations. One is active and the other is stative. Active is when there is an actor and an action and an object and a sense of direction, also a sense of an instrument action, which is denoted by this double arrow here. And stative is, for example, an object is in a particular state essentially, and that is for example, you might say the man is tall or the man is hungry or John is angry. All these things are stative essentially, they talk about a state essentially, and they would be represented by this triple bidirectional arrow. So, let us start with an example and then we will go into the details. So, supposing you want to represent this sentence, John hit his little dog. So, John is a picture producer or a noun phrase, so can be understood by itself. Hit is also an action, conceptually an action, and it also we can understand what the word hit by itself. And a two-way dependency between the two concepts is the core of this conceptualization, which means that John was the agent of the act of hitting. The dog is also a picture producer. We can understand a dog by itself also, but related to the act hit as an object of an action. Is dependent on hit, cannot be understood in the conceptualization without thinking about the word hit. That is known as objective dependency, and the sentence would be something like this, that John is the agent, hit is the action, and John hitting is the basic conceptualization, and the object of hitting is the dog essentially. So, as I said, we are using a graphical like notation here, but one can always write them in logic like notation by using predicate names for the different dependencies that we are representing here using arrows. So, we still have not processed two words in this sentence. We have processed John hit dog. Little is a picture aider. It embodies what we can call as attributive dependency, and it shows up as an attribute of the dog, that the dog was little or small or whatever. So, right now we are not using the CD actions, we are using English word actions, but gradually we will move towards them. His is a little bit more complex. First of all, it is a pronoun. It is a linguistic item which stands for something else, in this case for John. So, one picture producer is dependent on another picture producer. Prepositional dependency label indicates type of dependency possessed by. So, the dog is possessed by John. So, this has created for us a small representation of this sentence that John hit his little dog. We will take up from here in the next video.